The human circulatory system has two main circuits, the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. And let's start with the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary circuit, again, brings blood away from the right side of the heart to the lungs to pick up oxygen, drop off CO2, and then it brings that oxygenated blood back to the left side of the heart. So it begins with the pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk comes out of the right ventricle, and it branches into the right and left pulmonary arteries. Right? So these branch from the trunk, just like a tree. And then those pulmonary arteries, you have two of them, and one goes to each lung, since you have two lungs. And they begin to branch into smaller and smaller arteries. And then eventually you get to capillaries, and this is where your gas exchange occurs. And then you get to venules and veins. And then eventually you have you converge on four pulmonary veins, two coming from each side, and each of those dump oxygenated blood into the left atrium. Here you can see the deoxygenated blood in the heart moving down from the right atrium to the right ventricle and then entering the pulmonary circuit. Via that pulmonary trunk, you can see the pulmonary semilunar valve, and this pulmonary trunk separates into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Again, left and right of the patient here. Left pulmonary artery goes to the left lung, right pulmonary artery goes to the right lung. And as you can see, the arteries are blue, and that's because they're deoxygenated in this case. We tend to think of arteries as oxygenated because that's how they are in the systemic circuit, but it's all flipped in the pulmonary circuit. So these red vessels coming back are actually veins, and they wind up in these two pulmonary veins on each side, and those dump into this left atrium right here. This is where we have exchange between the air sacs of the lungs and the capillaries of the pulmonary circuit. Now let's move on and spend most of our time on the systemic circuit. Now the systemic circuit begins with the aorta, which is the largest of your elastic arteries coming out of your left ventricle of the heart. The aorta you only have one of, but most of your arteries are paired. You have a left and a right, since we're kind of symmetrical in our layout for the most part. But again, that's not true universally because things like our aorta, we only have a single one of. Your blood is drained and sent back into the heart in the right atrium by your superior and inferior vena cava. These are not paired in the typical sense. Yes, there are two of them, but they're not paired left and right. They're paired top and bottom, which is unusual. And the superior vena cava drains from your head, neck, and arms, and everything else in your body, your legs, your abdomen, your thoracic cavity, all is drained by the inferior vena cava, both of which dump into the right atrium. Now, it may seem like you have a lot of vessels to learn, and you do, but it's fewer than you think, because typically you have the same name for the artery and the vein. Not always. There are certainly plenty of exceptions, but you have a femoral artery and a femoral vein right next to each other in your leg. And also, your left and right sides are going to have arteries or veins of the same name, right? You have a left femoral artery and a left femoral vein, and a right femoral artery and a right femoral vein. The differences are those weird ones like your aorta and your superior and inferior vena cava, and also some of your veins in your neck and your limbs. You really have two sets of them. You have a deep set of veins and a superficial set of veins that we'll talk about. Your arteries are all deep because they have higher blood pressure, which means if you get nicked, you could bleed out more quickly, so they're protected by bones and more soft tissue. One of the reasons you have two sets of veins, especially in your limbs, is controlling body temperature. When you are hot, your venous blood will flow primarily towards the superficial veins, and when you're cold, it'll flow primarily toward the deep veins. This is one of the reasons why you look flushed and red when you're hot, because more of your blood's coming to the surface, and you look a little more pallid when you're cold. Your blood goes to your core. So let's start with the first vessels that branch off of your aorta. We know that your aorta is the first and largest of the elastic arteries to leave your heart. But other than the coronary vessels, which we know come immediately out right here to feed the heart, the first branches that come off are your brachiocephalic artery, or your brachiocephalic trunk, I should say, your left common carotid, and your left subclavian. 3 branches. It should be 4 because you have a subclavian artery that feeds your left arm, right? Subclavian means below the clavicle, so left subclavian feeds this arm here. You have a right subclavian to feed your right arm, and then you have a common carotid artery on your right and left side to feed the right and left halves of your head. So right subclavian, right common carotid, left subclavian. 4. But we only have 3, and it's because on the right side, this right subclavian and right common carotid are first together in one trunk, which then branches like a tree, right? Kind of like our pulmonary trunk branches into our left and right pulmonary arteries. This is your brachiocephalic trunk. And brachial, like brachial region, means your arm, right? Cephalic means head. So brachiocephalic means arm head. It's literally your arm head trunk, brachiocephalic trunk. So that's this right here, branches very quickly into your right subclavian, which feeds your arm, and your right common carotid, which feeds the right side of your head. Then the next 2 branches are your left common carotid and your left subclavian. Those are the main 3 branches that come off of your aorta. Then if you follow some of these arteries, they will branch, and as they move to different places and begin to branch, we'll call them different things, right? So this subclavian will do some branching here, and it will go under your armpit, and we know this is your axillary region because it's where you put your Axe body spray, right? So this becomes your axillary artery under here. And then it comes down along your arm into your brachial region and becomes your brachial artery. And then down here, it will branch into your radial and ulnar arteries. Radial is thumb side. You should remember that from last semester when you talked about the bones, right? I like to remember that R for rad, right? Thumbs up, rad. Radial is on your thumb side. U is the other one, ulnar on your pinky side. Now you also have a palmar arch that brings blood to your palm, and then from there you have digital arteries that come out to each of your digits. And your veins are going to look very similar but opposite. So let's switch it around and talk about your veins. So you have veins are going to bring blood back from your tissues through small veins that join together into larger and larger and larger veins till you reach the vena cava and the heart. So we have digital veins, and we have a palmar arch, both a deep and a superficial. In this particular image, the light blue are superficial, the dark blue are deep. In terms of deep veins, just like the arteries, you have an ulnar an ulnar vein and a radial vein that come back, and you will have a brachial vein that they kind of join to become, that dumps into an axillary vein, a subclavian vein, and that will dump along with your internal and external jugular veins into a brachiocephalic vein, superior vena cava. So those deep veins look a lot like your arteries. As far as superficial veins go, you have a cephalic vein, this light blue one here, which is on your thumb side, but more superficial. And when you're doing this, you're not only saying rad, you're pointing up to your head, cephalic, right? And then on the bottom here, by your pinky side, is your basilic, right? And that's on the base, the bottom there. And those come up here, right? Your basilic goes all the way up the side here. Your cephalic goes all the way up this side here. But they're connected by the median cubital vein. And this is an important one, particularly clinically, because this is generally where they're going to stick you and pull out blood when you're giving blood either for a test or for being a good person purposes. Now, all of this comes together ultimately into your right subclavian vein, which again will join with your internal and external jugular veins to form your brachiocephalic vein, arm head, which dumps into your superior vena cava when it joins with your left brachiocephalic vein. And yes, you don't have a left brachiocephalic artery, but you do have a left brachiocephalic vein. They come together on both sides in the case of veins. And the superior vena cava dumps into the right atrium of the heart. Now, if we move up and look a little bit closer where we enter the head, we've got our brachiocephalic trunk here. So this is the right side we're looking at. which branches into our right subclavian and our right common carotid. And our common carotid, whenever you have a common artery, it's going to branch into two, right? And so we have, in this case, an internal carotid artery, which goes up to your brain, and an external carotid artery, which feeds kind of all the outside stuff here, right? Goes to the muscles on the outside of your face and your skull, etc., etc., etc. So external carotid. Internal carotid, though, being particularly important given that it feeds your brain, and your brain is particularly important. So you can see here is at the base is the carotid sinus. That's the baroreceptor that we discussed earlier that detects blood pressure to make sure that you have enough blood pumping up to your brain. Now, also coming off of your subclavian artery is this, and this is your vertebral artery. And this goes literally through your vertebra. And so you may remember from last semester when you're learning how to tell the vertebra apart from one another. The cervical vertebra not only have a particular shape and they're smaller, but also in the transverse processes that stick out like wings, they have holes in them, right? It's called the transverse foramen or transverse foramina, plural. And no other type of vertebra has that, only cervical, and that's for these, right? There's a vein too, but the vertebral artery goes up through here, and ultimately, just like the internal carotid artery, the vertebral artery will feed the brain. You have two of them, a left and a right, just like you have two internal carotid arteries, a left and a right. But they come together, these left and right vertebral arteries, to form what's called the basilar artery, and that's actually what ends up feeding the brain here. Now we're flipping again and looking at the veins, and now we're draining the head, right? And we have all of these veins of the head, temporal, maxillary, facial, etc., occipital. They all come together into the external jugular, which drains the outside of the skull and stuff. The internal jugular drains the brain, and the vertebral vein, right next to the vertebral artery, drains the brain as well. So these two drain the brain, the external jugular drains the outside, but they all come together along with the subclavian vein to form this brachiocephalic vein. Again, we have a left one and a right one. All of them come together, arm, head, to form the brachiocephalic vein. Now let's zoom in even further with the brain. So I said that you had really two sets of arteries that feed the brain. You have your internal carotid arteries, and this is them right here, right? We are looking up from the bottom, like looking up kind of through where my chin would be at the base of the brain. So these internal carotid arteries would be going up that way, and you can see them cut off right here, the right and the left. And you also have vertebral arteries, which come up along the cervical vertebra, which aren't shown here, and join together into the basilar artery. And this basilar artery and these internal carotid arteries feed the brain through something called the cerebral arterial circle, or it is also called the circle of Willis frequently. And what this is like a circle freeway. These are all connected by these communicating arteries, right? Your anterior communicating artery and your posterior communicating arteries. And they form this little circle, and just like in your circle freeway around Cincinnati, 275, if there's a wreck on 275 heading west, right, you can go east and come around and still get where you wanted to go. It'll take a little bit longer, but you can get there. This is an anastomosis, like we talked about earlier. And this is particularly important for your brain because you do not want a clot to prevent blood from getting to a particular part of a brain and giving you a stroke. And so this cerebral arterial circle helps prevent that. Now, to drain the brain, we have these sinuses that most of your veins dump into, like your superior sagittal sinus, which, by the way, is where your cerebrospinal fluid empties into via those arachnoid villi or arachnoid granulations. You also have some sinuses down here, right? Sigmoid sinuses and transverse sinus coming through the side. All of them empty, though, into the internal jugular and the vertebral vein, which drain the brain. They are the veins that drain the brain. I'm going to stop now.